Look at this. All right. Well, man, look at the energy here. Hey, 9:30 service, meet the 11 o'clock. You know, this is it. Yeah. If you looked around, you're like, you go here? Yeah, they did. They do. And those of you who could not make it and you're online, thanks for being here too. Can we give a shout out to them as well for joining us? Yes. Some of them like the 9:30 and they're kind of upset about it, but so sorry. But yeah. Well, friends, we are in week 2 of a series called Your Move, and we're talking about moving into this year with confidence. And last week, if you missed it, I brought this out. Remember this guy right here? Some of you guys I was uncomfortable then, and I'm uncomfortable now. So this is, anybody know what this is? I kind of talked. Yes, thank you, a Pulaski. Now, here's the deal with this thing. It's not a weapon, it's not an axe. It's a Pulaski, and what it does is it is used as a tool to forge a path, to clear trails in the woods. And as I was thinking about this even this week, I thought, this is a great analogy for even using your faith to forge your future. And so if last week you missed it, basically it was that. It was that what's in your hand gives you confidence to move forward. And for some of us, we're not holding something in our hands that will last. And so I propose to you that you hold the knowledge of God in your hands to forge your future. And so I want to take the same vein of that, talking about how do you do this. Because last week we talked about moving from this, we went to an Old Testament story talking about grasshoppers. You guys remember that? Anybody? Grasshoppers, and I proposed the idea of moving from a grasshopper mentality to a giant slayer mentality. How do you move from there? And we have to move away from comparison, because comparison corrupts everything. It just corrupts everything. And so comparison cannot be the source or the supply of your confidence. And so this week, I want to move us forward talking about, identifying and defeating your giant. So turn to your neighbor and say, I'm going to slay I'm going to slay a giant today. I'm going to slay a giant. By the way, did someone give you a wise crack after that? They're like, no, you're not. Did someone say, just take out the trash, buddy? Just take out the trash, okay? So let's start with that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to the Old Testament. Now, the good thing is we have an app, and the app gives you just the outline of all the verses I want to use today. And in fact, it gives you points as well. Because guess what, people? This sermon comes with points. Yes, like I said before, most of my sermons are pointless, but this time, I got points, people. I got 4 points, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in. Thank you. Wow. Felt the love, maybe. I don't know. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the Old Testament, 1 Samuel, and we're going to talk about a story that's pretty classic, okay? It's a story about a giant, about David, and for the first time, if you get this answer right in church, you're like, this is a big deal for me. It's David and... Yes, everybody knows that. We're talking about David and Goliath. But what we're going to find is we're going to find tools to really defeat our giants, our Goliath. So let's jump right in, okay? We're in 1 Samuel, and before I read this passage to you, okay, if you want to find it, you can find it. Let me give you the context, okay? So it says, then Goliath, right? Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came down of the Philistines' ranks to face the forces of Israel, and he was 9 feet tall. Let's stop right there. He was 9 feet tall. Now, let me give you the context. What's happening? Who is Goliath? What's up? So we know he's a Philistine. But why is he coming down from the ranks? What is he talking about? So what's happening? Here's the context. The context is that the Philistines are coming against the Israelites. So in modern day, if you look at the geography of Israel, you've got a mountain range, and then you got a coastal plain, and then you have a valley. And the coastal plain is right now modern day Tel Aviv, and the mountain range modern day right now is Jerusalem. But in the valley is called I think Shephelah. It's called the Shephelah, and the Shephelah valleys is the connection between the coastal plain and the mountains. the Philistines were in the coastal plain. The Israelites were on the mountaintop. And what the Philistines were trying to do was conquer them. But they didn't want to go down to this valley. Neither did the Israelis wanted to come down to the valley as well, because it was a very strategic point. It was kind of a kill zone. So what happens is that the armies basically are they're in a standstill. Like, no one wants to come down and fight, because they know that whoever comes down first is going to get destroyed. And so they kind of hold their ground, and people are wondering what's happening. What's really interesting is you remember last week, if you don't remember last week, if you remember the scriptures at all, that the people who surveyed the land, the spies that went to survey the land, they went and they surveyed for how many days? Anybody remember that? 40 days. They did that for 40 days. And because they didn't step into what God had for them, they wandered for how many days? 40 days. So now what's happening is, again, this is interesting, that these two armies are at a standstill for, guess what? How many days? 40 days. So what's happening here is finally, Goliath suggests a single person combat. Basically, you take one person from each army and we'll fight and we'll determine the war. Obviously, the guy is how many feet tall? 9 feet tall. Some translations say he's a little bit less. Regardless, he is a big guy. So the context is that you find is that you have these two armies, and Goliath comes down and he says, hey, anybody will fight me. If anybody fights me, you win the war. So that's what's happening right now. It's been a long time. The verse, though, continues to describe who Goliath was and what he looked like. So it says here in the next sentence, it says he wore a bronze helmet, his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. Now, don't ask me what a coat of mail is. That's a lot of mail, apparently. Okay. Then he also wore a bronze leg armor, and he carried a what? Bronze javelin on his shoulder. Okay, but it keeps on going. Guess what? The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam. Who knows what that means? Okay. Tipped with an iron spearhead, weighed about how many pounds? 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying another thing, a what? Shield. So the picture is this giant, this Goliath is decked out. He looks just intimidating. He is a mountain of a man, and now he's covered with hundreds of pounds, like 100 pounds of weight, and he's walking. No one in their right mind would want to fight a Goliath like that. But what we realize is that you and I have to figure out what our Goliath really looks like. The first thing I would say is you and I have to pick our giant. See, we think that giants pick us, but we pick our giants. And so if this scripture tells us anything, it tells us that we need to look at what is our giant made of. See, for some of us, we think our giant is debt. We have a giant debt that we need to get rid of. We have a giant habit, a giant addiction that we got. We have a giant goal. We have a giant purpose. That is not your giant that you got to slay. Some of us are like, you know what? I really need to get my weight in check. This is the year. That is not your giant. You have to identify your giant, because you're going to pick it. If you pick the weight loss as your giant, you've picked the wrong giant. See, I recently posted that my second book is now on pre-order on Amazon. I know, I'm just excited. Thank you. You guys are too kind. Now, I'll tell you why it was a big deal for me, because my first book that came out about 10 years ago, I did not write. Like, I didn't physically write it. I had a collaborator, her name is on the book, and I didn't write the book. And so I just told a story, and she was an experienced, talented writer that wrote a book, and it was amazing. Sold a lot of copies, amazing. It was a memoir, my story. It was great. It was awesome. And man, people were like, man, I can't believe it. You are an author. And I'm like, yeah, but not really. You know what I'm saying? Yes. And then real authors, people who actually write their own books, they're like, you're not really an author. I'm like, whatever. I got a book. It sold more than yours. Whatever, okay? I knew this. I knew that if I was going to write a second book, I'm going to have to conquer a giant. And my giant, friends, is my disabilities. So I have a learning disability, okay? Apparently I have a few. But, so I am dyslexic. Any dyslexics in the house? Okay, one, okay, good. You're like, I don't know, maybe one. Okay, I've got dysgraphia. If you're like, what is dysgraphia? Look it up. I also have dyscalculia, which I confuse reading numbers and words. So if you ever got a text from me, you're like, what is he saying? That's me, in full effect, people, in full effect. Okay, and I knew that this second book, I really felt that I needed to. And the people, my agent and all that, they were like, you need to write this book. And I was like, oh God, how? Oh God, how? Let me tell you what my giant was. My giant was not 40,000 words that I had to write, not this book that I had to write. My giant was my insecurity. I mean, I don't know. Have you ever tried something that the voices in your head, like they throw a party and they find friends and they all start talking negative things to you? Do you know what I'm saying? Like this one voice finds friends, like as a committee now. There's a committee of people. Like they're having conversations of how terrible you are. You know, like they're in your head. It was crippling sometimes. Crippling, especially when you type and you're like, oh God, I can't even type. What is wrong with me? Like how am I gonna do this? How am I gonna do this? And so I just wanna propose to you so that maybe your weight loss has nothing to do with the actual weight loss. That's not the giant. The giant is your self-worth. That's your giant that you've got to tackle. It's your depression. It's your self-loathing because of a habit, because of something. It's this paralyzing anxiety in your life. It's the cutting. It's the self-harm that we do because we want to slay a giant. We have a big goal. We have a big goal, but the giant is more sinister. It's so complicated. And so if this story tells us anything, it describes the details of a giant. And I think knowing what you are wrestling with first is a game changer. For some of you, you have to identify and pick the giant you are going to slay. It is not this goal. It is something deeper. It's emotional. It's something else. It's self-confidence. It's depression. It's despair. It's grief. It's the sadness that you've been holding on to for a very long time. It's this distrust of people that you're like, I don't trust anybody. It's like this idea of like, I don't want to be vulnerable. I like to keep things under wraps and everybody, it's all good, and you don't want to share your secrets. That is your giant that you have to pick. So if you pick your giant, then what do you have to do? Well, this passage tells us what happens. So it describes Goliath, and then it says here that David shows up and starts asking around, and the people tell him. So let's just jump into that. So basically the people are like, have you seen what? The giant, the man asked. They're asking David. It's like he comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. In fact, he will give him, check this out. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempt from paying what? Taxes. Wow, this is crazy, right? This is crazy. Now let's stop right here. So what's happening? What's happening is that because of this stalemate, in a sense, no one's doing anything, and David shows up to the scene. Now, why is David there? He's not in the military, by the way. He is, in fact, one of 8 brothers. His 2 brothers are in the army. He shows up, seriously, on a DoorDash mission. I kid you not. he's bringing food and dropping it off to his brothers. That's the story. He shows up and he goes, what have you guys been doing for 40 days? And they go, have you seen the giant? Have you seen the giant? He does this, he does this. So David finds out there what's really happening. What's happening is that these people who have been rescued from and come out of Egypt, these people who have found their first king Saul, are now fighting their first battle. And the stories of old is like, hey, God has been with us and with with generations in the past, and he is with us, he's with us. But now we are fighting this one first big war, and we are just not doing anything. David is going, what is happening? Why is no one wanting to fight this guy? And they're like, have you seen him? Have you seen the guy? And what we realize here is this when you read this. He says this, he says, who is this what? Uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God. That is David's response. Who is this guy who would do this? See, what's funny though is I would think like if David was going to pick his giant and volunteer, he would say, I'm going to get free taxes, number one. Hey, that's awesome. And I'm going to get a wife out of that. But guess what? The wife means I'm going to be in line for the kingdom here. Like I'll marry the king's daughter. I mean, I'm in line, so my future is set. But his motivation, or what he says is, how is it possible? How is it possible that this guy defies us? Us, we're not special people, but they're God, but who is behind us is special. How is this? See, the second thing that I think the story tells us is, number one, pick your giant, but number two, you have to know your why. You got to know your why. And his why was not, like I said, all the benefits. His why was, how is this possible? Like how? Like he is disturbed by that. I think for some of us, I want to just say this. I mean, man, for me, sometimes it's just easy to live in disappointment. I mean, it's just easy to live in sadness sometimes. It's mentally exhausting sometimes, but then some of us are totally at peace with our anxiety. Like basically you've said, it's not gonna get any better. You're at a standstill, it doesn't matter, it's not gonna get any better. So it is what it is in life. And for some of us, you don't have a strong enough why. That's why you have tried to wrestle this battle. You've tried to accomplish the goals that you have, the businesses you want to start, the weight that you want to lose, the debt you want to get out of, the career, the relationships, the love that you want to find, the family that you want to create, all those things. The reason why possibly you've failed before those is, number one, you haven't picked the right giant. Number two, you just don't have a strong enough why. Like, I want to be in a relationship. Why? Because everybody else is in a relationship. Really? I want a house and I want this. Why? Why do you want a house? Because that's what you do. You get a house. We want to have kids. Why do you want to have kids? That's what you do. No, that is not a strong enough why. Like, why do you? Because I'll tell you what, your insecurity, your depression, your despair, your resistance, those little small demons, your negative thoughts, they're going to come at you, and you and I better have a strong enough why. To go, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. Because when you pick your giant, when you pick coming against insecurity and failure, when you pick coming against negative thoughts, I'll tell you what, those negative thoughts will, like I said, they'll find friends, they'll recruit people to discourage you. They might even recruit your family. Hello. They might even recruit your family. You decide to do this and your family goes, why are you doing this? Check this out in the story, what happens to David. So David's like, he wants to pick this battle, right? He wants to do this. And so what happens is he meets his older brother, right? And his brother knows that David has been asking around what's happening. And his older brother and David have a conversation. And I just really wanted you to see this and hear this conversation, because I feel like this will some of you brothers will be seen right here. Younger brothers will be seen right here, okay? Check this out, okay? So when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was what? angry. He was like, what are you doing? Talk to the guys. You're not, and then he says this. He says, what are you doing here anyways? What are you doing on here? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Okay? So then he says, hey, by the way, what about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? Like, oh my gosh, have you ever experienced that? Oh man, that is a, whoo, that's like, hey, aren't you supposed to do something so important to go somewhere else? Don't you have a few goats and sheep? Why don't you just do that? Hey. And then he goes, I know your pride, man. I know your pride and your deceit. Have you ever had family misunderstand you? Can I get an amen? Okay. Oh my gosh. And then his older brother is now mad at him. He says, you just want to see the battle. Like you just want to see bloody stuff going on. And David's like, what? No, what? He's like, and then he says this. He said, what have I done now? This is a classic younger sibling response. I was only asking a question. Like, what's up? Why? See, I think for some of us, once you go after a giant, not everybody is going to understand. And so what happens? So now you've got Goliath waiting. David finds out what's going on. He goes, you know what? I want to fight him. I should fight them. And so he's talking to people. His brother is upset. But what happens is news spreads. News spreads of this guy who's volunteering because no one else was volunteering to fight this giant. So news spreads to the king. So the king calls him in. He's like, hey, so I hear that you want to fight this giant. Okay, and this is what the king said. This is what Saul said. He said, don't be what? Ridiculous. He said, don't be ridiculous. There is no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You will possibly die, but there is no way you're going to win this. And then he says, you're only a what? A boy. And he has been a man, not a boy, a man of war since his youth. But David's persisted. He said, listen, let me just tell you, and I hope my brother's listening too. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats. So that's there. So that's that right there. So beat that. And what happens after that story, after he says that, is that Saul goes, you know what, okay, sure. Just do it. And he tries to say, okay, you know what, at least wear my armor. Like you don't even have anything. Just wear my armor. Wear my armor. But what we find here is that David, the story tells us that you got to pick your giant. You got to know your why. But then you, not me, for you have to have a strategy, a unique strategy that is true to who you are. A unique strategy that's true to who you are. Your weight loss or my weight loss, my getting out of debt and your getting out of debt, my breaking this habit versus your breaking this habit, my overcoming insecurity looks very different than your overcoming insecurity. My self-worth, getting over that and feeding that looks very different from yours. Everybody's looks different. But I'll tell you what everybody's going to try to do. They're going to tell you, this is how I did it, so do it this way. Saul did the same thing. He was like, if you're going to fight this, here's what you need to do. You need to wear my armor. So he gives him this. And here's what David said, because he had his own unique strategy. He says this. He says, I can't go in these. So he wears the stuff. He says, I can't. He says, I'm not what? I'm not used to them. This is not me. See, I think some of us have been trying someone else's strategies. No, hey, do this and you'll get over this. Really? I mean, I tell you what, I would give people advice to get over or go through grief until I actually had to go through it. And now I'm like, I'm not going to say anything. I don't know. Because no one goes through grief really well. No one can be like, grief, I got that down. No, everybody is unique. And so it's so easy for us to look at other people and go, hey, I got over this, why don't you? Hey, I don't feel this way, why don't you? Hey, spouse, why aren't you like just like me? And David's like, hey, king, I'm not like you. And guess what? I'm not gonna fight this giant like you would fight this giant. I'm not even gonna fight this giant like the giant thinks I'm gonna fight him. I have my own what? I got my own strategy. So what was his strategy? Okay? Which is would be hilarious to be there when Saul sees this. What did David do? He picks up what? 5 smooth stones from the stream and puts them into the shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and what? Sling. Remember that word, sling. Sling. He started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Now, the sling that we think of, I'm not quite sure what you think of. If you think of one of these guys right here, this is not the sling that he picked up. In fact, when he picked up those stones and his sling, historically, that move right there, it was in fact a military move. You see, back in those days, there were 3 groups of military. There were these people on horseback or animal back. Then there was just like ground soldiers, like dressed up in armor, who'd go and have battle one-on-one. And then there were the slingers or archers. The archers would not be like fighting one-on-one, regardless of all the cool movies we see. Okay, they'll be up in the distance, safe. They're the slingers. Slingers were so accurate back in the day, and history tells us this. They're so accurate, and the way they would rotate the stones, in a particular stones, when it hit their target, it was so accurate, but also so deadly. In fact, some research say it was the speed, the impact power of a gun, a bullet. And so when the slingers would sling their stones and hit, it would be like shooting someone from a distance. So when David picked up that, and when he said, hey, I've taken care of goats and sheep, what he also said was, there were lions and bears, and I took care of them. And I did that because I'm a slinger. No one kind of caught that until he picked up those. Goliath didn't catch that at all. So he had a unique what? Strategy. He's like, I'm gonna fight this. I'm gonna do it my way. So he just has his regular stuff, his bag, 5 stones, which by the way, historically it tells us that where he picked up those, in that valley, where he picked up those stones, ironically, were so dense, they were like not regular stones. They're very different. They wouldn't shatter. They were intense. So he picked them on purpose. And so he had a strategy. He also knew not just his own strengths, he knew Goliath's weaknesses. You see, your insecurity has weaknesses. You're like, what? Yeah, your negative thoughts has weaknesses. If you counteract them, like if you do certain things, like there are certain things you can do to give your insecurity, your self-hatred, an upper hand. There are activities, there are people that you have chosen to still continue to be allow in your life. And I'll tell you what they're doing. They're feeding your giant. They're feeding your giant. You're like, Naeem, but they're feeding your insecurity. Are there people in your life, come on, you walk into the room or you have a conversation with them and you feel amazing. You're like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. And then there are people, you have a phone conversation, forget the phone conversation, you get a text message, and in that text message, you're like, I'm a loser. Because that text message has something else in there. See, what they're doing is they're feeding your giant. David knew his strengths and weaknesses. He also knew his giant strengths and weaknesses. So what he does is he picks up those stones, and what happens then? And then it says, Goliath walks out towards David with his shield bearer ahead of him, which, remember, why? That's the question, why? And now he's staring in contempt at this ruggedly faced boy. Like he looks at David, and he is flipping out. So what he does, he says this, am I a what? Am I a what? Am I a what? Am I a dog? Like, am I a dog? Is it that you would come at me with a stick? Am I a dog? And then he says, and he cursed David by names of his gods. And then he says this, he says what? He says what? Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. Come over here. Now, right there in this passage, there is so much that can be found out about like a giant's weakness. For example, okay, he was how many feet tall? You guys remember? 9 feet tall. Now, giantism is not a good thing. It's a disease. Giantism, like some of the famous giants that we know, Andre the Giant being one of them, right? The tallest man in the world that ever lived was about 8 feet 11 inches, and he was 24 years old when he died, and he was still growing. Giantism is a tumor in the brain that your growth hormone, it just runs wild, and it keeps on. A couple of things it does. If you're that tall, that tumor affects your mobility and your vision. When Goliath was like, come here so I can see you, because I can't see you. He didn't say that. The reason why he's walking with another person holding this could be that he has to make sure he's going the right place. He's a mountain of a man for sure. He's massive, massive. Okay? I mean, just horrifyingly, big. But I don't know if he can see. And guess what? What does he think is going to happen? He thinks the battle is going to be what? One-on-one. He assumes David's going to be a man with armor, with a sword, not a boy, no armor, with a stick. So he's like, what, am I a dog? What's happening? Am I a dog? So here's what happens, right? And if you know the story, this is amazing. So then David runs. He goes after him. Goliath moves closer to attack, but David runs quicker. Why is David running quicker? Because Goliath can't move that fast. And he takes, reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out what? A stone, because he was good at this. He hurled it, and with his what? Sling weapon, people. And then he hit the Philistine in the forehead. And then the story gets R-rated. Okay, if you know the story, Goliath goes down, David runs up, takes Goliath's sword, and someone loses their head. Okay. It's the kid that laughed. That's disturbing. I'm just joking. So, wow, what? This is David and Goliath. He's the underdog. Was he? Was he the underdog? I don't know. He just knew how to take down a giant. See, for some of us, all you have to do now, knowing all these things, is the last thing, is the fourth point. For those of you who are like, I need the fourth point, is you need to step into the arena. You need to head towards Goliath quickly, with a strategy, armed with your why, and knowing that you picked Goliath. Goliath didn't pick you. See, friends, for some of us, our goals and our dreams are so big. So big. So big. The life that we imagine, the life that we feel like we were created for is so beautiful. That's not your giant. The giant is the insecurity and the discipline and the despair and the sadness and the grief and the distrust and the comparison and the negative thoughts, those are the giants. And you, my friends, get to pick them. But if you don't want to live a life bigger, if you don't want to live a life more fulfilling, you don't have to fight a giant. You could just live just there, existing. Not for 40 days, maybe for 40 years. And so my prayer for all of us is, hey, your giants are not as big as you think they are. Your insecurity, your anxiety is not as big as bad. It might look daunting. It's not. Your addictive behavior, it's not. You have unique skills. There's something you have that your insecurity does not. And all you have to do is figure out how not to feed that Goliath and know what is true to yourself and have a strategy. And that might involve other people. For some of us, you're like, I want to reach this, I reach this. Your strategy might be, hey, I got to know other people in the faith. You want to have the deeper faith. Guess what? You're missing out on community. You're like, no, I've tried other things. No, that's what you have to try. You got to try something that you haven't tried before, but still be true to yourself. And so my question is, what? Have you picked a giant? Pick one. Have you already picked a giant? Then don't quit. Don't quit. Do not quit on this. You're like, Naeem, it's so many. Goliath has brothers. I get it. I understand that. I understand that. But I can just tell you from overcoming insecurity and just negative thoughts to writing this book, I've won a battle. I haven't won the war. I haven't won the war. I just won a battle because I wanted to get to a place. I haven't won the war. What that means is I'm going to have to war again and again because my giants don't quit. How about yours? They don't quit. But what's amazing about it is that in a place like this, it reminds us that there's a God who does not quit. That there's a God who's bigger and badder than all the giants that we think of and does not have weaknesses. A God who wants to be with us, who wants to give you the faith and the life that you want. He wants the closeness you want to feel with God, he wants you to feel as well. And so here's what I want to do. I want to pray for us. Is that cool? Let's stand together. So Lord God, we come before you. And we're just grateful to be here. We're grateful, God, in light of what's going on in our world, in light of what's going on in LA and in other parts of the world, God. We feel so fortunate that we can be in this space. Yes, we have our own struggles. Yes, we have. But we are in a place, God, that we can hear you. God, we're grateful because other people right now, they're not in a place where they can just breathe because of things that have happened in their life, the devastation. But God, we can. So God, we feel for them. Our hearts break for them. But God, you are doing something in our hearts right now. In this moment, God, I pray that for some of us, we would be reminded, God, that the giant is worth slaying. It is worth slaying. And our why has to be how. How is it possible that the God who gave his son for me and bought me with the price of and gave me a life, a new life, how can I keep on living a life defeated? How can I do that? How is it possible for me to continue to live the life that Jesus, you rescued me from? Spirit, how is it possible, Spirit, that you can be in us and yet we allow ourselves to be led by our emotions? How is it possible? It cannot be. So God, I pray that today we enter into the battle. We enter into the arena. looking at our giant, knowing, God, that there is no way possible that the God who has rescued us, who has so much for us, who wants all good things for us, there's no way He's not going to help us slay this giant. God, remind us that you are the God. You are the God who wants all things good for us. God, as we respond this morning, let us experience that deeply, God, deeply. And then, and let us whisper, or maybe shout within ourselves to our giants, you will not conquer us. You will not conquer us. God, today we declare war against our Goliaths, against our insecurities, against our fears, against our worries. And we thank you, God. We thank you. Let's respond.